The courtroom held its breath as the 17-year-old boy's trembling hand moved instinctively to his chest, clutching something beneath his worn jacket, a secret that would shatter every assumption in that room and bring tears to the eyes of even the most hardened observers. What Judge Frank Caprio would discover in the next 15 minutes would not only redefine justice, but remind everyone present of the profound humanity that sometimes hides beneath the surface of desperation. The fluorescent lights of Providence Municipal Court hummed with their usual indifference, casting harsh shadows across the polished wooden benches. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way except for the thin, dark-haired teenager who now stood before the bench, his shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself smaller, invisible. His name was Marcus Rivera, and the charge sheet before Judge Caprio read simply, "Theft of property, one bicycle, valued at $340. Marcus wore a jacket 2 sizes too large, the sleeves hanging past his wrists, the fabric faded from navy to a tired gray blue. Beneath it, a white t-shirt that had seen too many wash cycles. His jeans were clean but worn thin at the knees, and his sneakers, once white, now a patchwork of scuffs and repairs, had been resoled at least twice. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Dark, intelligent, and swimming with something between fear and fierce determination. They were the eyes of someone far older than 17, someone who had already seen too much of life's cruelty. Judge Caprio, known throughout Rhode Island for his compassionate approach to justice, nevertheless wore his sternest expression this morning. The case seemed straightforward, almost disappointingly simple. A teenager caught on surveillance camera cutting the lock on a bicycle outside a grocery store, riding away as the owner emerged from shopping. The bike had been recovered, returned to its owner, but the law demanded accountability. The prosecution was pushing for the maximum penalty, a $500 fine plus restitution, community service, and a mark on the young man's permanent record. "Mr. Rivera," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor." The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, but it didn't waver. "And how do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Marcus lifted his chin slightly, meeting the judge's gaze for the first time. There was no defiance there, no attempt to deflect responsibility. Just a quiet acceptance that made something in Caprio's chest tighten uncomfortably. The prosecutor, a young woman in her early 30s with a briefcase full of similar cases, stood to present the facts. "Your Honor, this is a clear-cut case of theft. The defendant was caught on camera. The stolen property was recovered in his possession, and he has admitted guilt. The state requests the standard penalty for juvenile theft, a $500 fine, 50 hours of community service, and probation until his 18th birthday." $500. Judge Caprio watched the boy's face as the number hung in the air. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't protest, but his hand moved again to his chest, fingers pressing against something beneath the jacket. It was a small gesture, unconscious, but Caprio had spent 40 years reading body language in this courtroom. That movement meant something. "Mr. Rivera," the judge said, leaning forward slightly, "before I make my decision, I'd like to understand something. You're 17 years old. You attend Hope High School. I have your records here, and your grades are exemplary. 3.8 GPA, advanced placement courses, not a single disciplinary incident on your record. You volunteer at the community center 3 times a week." He paused, letting the contradiction settle over the courtroom. "So help me understand. Why would a young man with your record, your potential, risk everything to steal a bicycle?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's jaw worked silently, as if he were chewing on words too difficult to swallow. His eyes dropped to the floor, and for a moment, Judge Caprio thought he wouldn't answer at all. "I needed it, Your Honor," Marcus finally said, so quietly that the court reporter had to lean forward to catch the words. "You needed it," Caprio repeated, his tone neutral but probing. "Son, I've heard a lot of reasons in this courtroom over the years. I've heard people say they needed money for food, for rent, for medicine. But you didn't steal money. You stole a bicycle. A specific bicycle, a girl's bicycle, pink with white streamers on the handlebars. According to the report, you passed 3 other bikes that would have been easier to take. So I'll ask you again, and I want the truth this time. Why that bicycle? The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Marcus's hand was still pressed against his chest, and now Judge Caprio could see the outline of something beneath the fabric. Something small, round, hanging from what might have been a chain or ribbon. "It was for my sister," Marcus said, and his voice cracked on the word sister. "Her birthday was last week. She turned 9. And you couldn't afford to buy her a birthday present?" The judge's tone wasn't judgmental, merely curious, gently prying open the door to the truth. "No, sir. Yes, sir, I couldn't afford it, but—" Marcus stopped, his throat working convulsively. "It's not just about the money." Judge Caprio set down his pen and folded his hands on the desk before him. This was the moment he had learned to recognize over decades on the bench. The moment when the real story began to emerge from beneath the official one. "Tell me about your sister, Marcus." The boy's composure, which had held so firmly until now, began to crack. His eyes grew bright with unshed tears, and his breathing became shallow. "Her name is Sophia. She has cerebral palsy. She's been in a wheelchair since she was 3. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the direction of the testimony but bound by duty to maintain her position. Judge Caprio raised a hand slightly, a gesture that asked for patience, for time. "Go on," he said gently. "My mom works 2 jobs," Marcus continued, the words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. "She's a nurse's aide during the day and she cleans offices at night. My dad left when Sophia was diagnosed, said he couldn't handle it, couldn't handle having a broken kid." The bitterness in those last 2 words could have stripped paint. "So it's just the 3 of us. Mom does everything she can, but the medical bills, the special equipment Sophia needs, the physical therapy that insurance doesn't cover, there's never anything left over." Judge Caprio's expression had softened, the stern mask of judicial authority giving way to something more human, more vulnerable. "And the bicycle?" "Sophia loves watching the other kids in our neighborhood ride bikes. Every day after school, she sits by the window and watches them go by. Last year, for her birthday, I promised her that one day I'd get her a bike too. I told her I'd find a way." Marcus's voice broke completely now, tears streaming down his face without shame. "I've been saving for months, Your Honor. I work at the bodega on weekends. I tutor kids for $5 an hour. I collect cans for the recycling money. But it's never enough. I had $83 saved, and the cheapest bike I could find was $340. "So you stole one," the judge said, but there was no condemnation in his voice. "I know it was wrong," Marcus said quickly, desperately. "I know that, Your Honor. I knew it when I was doing it. But Sophia's birthday was coming, and I'd already broken my promise from the year before, and she never complains, never asks for anything, and she just wanted to feel normal for one day, to have what the other kids have." He stopped, unable to continue, his whole body shaking with the force of his tears. The courtroom had become a cathedral of silence. Even the prosecutor had tears in her eyes now, her earlier certainty replaced by visible discomfort. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, his hand coming up to rub his face, and those who knew him well could see the emotion working behind his eyes. "Marcus," the judge said after a long moment, "what's under your jacket?" The boy's hand flew to his chest again, protective, almost panicked. "Nothing, Your Honor." "I don't think that's true." Caprio's voice was still gentle, but it carried the weight of authority. "You've been holding on to something under there since you walked into my courtroom. I'd like to see what it is." For a moment, it seemed Marcus might refuse. His fingers clutched the fabric of his jacket, knuckles white with tension. Then, slowly, with trembling hands, he unzipped the jacket and reached inside. What he pulled out made several people in the courtroom gasp audibly. It was a medal, hanging from a faded red, white, and blue ribbon. Not large, not particularly ornate, but unmistakable in its significance. The words, Youth Community Service Award, were engraved across the front, along with a date from 3 months earlier. "Where did you get that?" Judge Caprio asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew. "The mayor gave it to me," Marcus said, his voice hollow now, drained of emotion. "For my volunteer work at the community center. I've been tutoring kids there, helping with the after-school program, organizing food drives. They said I'd logged over 500 hours of community service in the past year." He looked down at the medal in his hand, and a bitter smile crossed his face. "I was wearing it when I stole the bike. I took it off before I did it because I didn't want to dishonor it. But I couldn't leave it at home either. Sophia was there, and if she saw it, she'd want to know where I was going, and I couldn't lie to her face." The irony was almost too painful to bear. Here was a boy who had given 500 hours of his life to his community, who had been recognized by the city for his selfless service, now standing before a judge for stealing a bicycle to give his disabled sister a moment of joy. Judge Caprio stood, a rare occurrence in his courtroom. He stepped down from the bench, his robes rustling in the silence, and walked to where Marcus stood. The boy looked up at him with eyes that had long since given up on expecting kindness from the world. "May I?" the judge asked, gesturing to the medal. Marcus handed it over with shaking hands. Caprio held it carefully, turning it over to read the inscription on the back. "For Marcus Rivera, who gives without counting the cost, who serves without seeking reward, who loves without condition." The judge's eyes were bright with tears now, making no attempt to hide them. "Mr. Rivera," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been a judge for 40 years. I've seen thousands of cases, heard thousands of stories. Some people come before me looking for excuses, trying to escape responsibility for their actions. You're not one of those people. You knew what you were doing was wrong, and you did it anyway, not for yourself, but for love. Not to gain something, but to give something to someone who couldn't get it any other way." He paused, looking down at the medal in his hands, then back at the boy before him. "The law says you committed a crime. The law says you should be punished. And the law is right. We can't have a society where people can simply take what they want, even for good reasons. But the law is also incomplete. It doesn't account for the fullness of human experience, for the impossible choices that poverty and circumstance force upon good people." Judge Caprio turned to address the entire courtroom now, his voice rising with passion. This young man has already given more to his community than most people give in a lifetime. He's sacrificed his time, his energy, his youth to help others. He's cared for his sister with a devotion that would humble most adults. And when faced with an impossible choice, break the law or break his sister's heart, he chose to bear the burden of guilt himself rather than let her suffer another disappointment. He walked back to the bench, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, the medal still in his hand, and looked directly at Marcus. "I'm going to make a decision now that some people might disagree with. The prosecutor might appeal it, the newspapers might criticize it, but I don't care. Because sometimes justice isn't about following the letter of the law. Sometimes it's about recognizing that the law exists to serve humanity, not the other way around." The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward, holding its collective breath. "Marcus Rivera," Judge Caprio said formally, "I find you guilty of theft, as you have admitted. However, in light of the extraordinary circumstances of this case, in recognition of your character and your service to this community, and in acknowledgement that you have already suffered more than any punishment I could impose, I am suspending all fines and fees. I am ordering no community service, as you have already given more service than anyone could reasonably ask. Instead, I am going to do something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting several bills. "This is $340, the cost of the bicycle you tried to steal. I want you to take this money, and I want you to go to that store, and I want you to buy your sister the birthday present she deserves. Not as a thief, but as a brother. Not with shame, but with pride." The courtroom erupted. The prosecutor was on her feet, objecting, but Judge Caprio silenced her with a look. Marcus stood frozen, unable to process what was happening, tears streaming down his face. "But, Your Honor," he managed to say, "I can't take your money. I can't—" "You can and you will," Caprio said firmly. "Because I'm not giving it to you, Marcus. I'm giving it to Sophia. Every child deserves to feel joy on their birthday, and no child should be denied that because of circumstances beyond their control. You tried to give her that gift through the wrong means, but your heart was in the right place. Let me help you do it the right way." He came around the bench again and pressed the money into Marcus's hand, then placed the medal back around his neck. "You wear this with honor," he said softly, so only Marcus could hear. "Because honor isn't about never making mistakes. It's about the choices you make when the world gives you no good options. You chose love over law, and while I can't condone theft, I can understand and respect the impossible position you were in." Marcus's legs seemed to give out, and he sank to his knees, sobbing openly now, all pretense of composure abandoned. Judge Caprio placed a hand on his shoulder and let him cry, let him release the weight of months of desperation and fear and shame. Finally, when the boy had composed himself enough to stand, the judge spoke once more, this time addressing the entire courtroom. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. We live in a society that measures worth in dollars and cents, that punishes poverty as if it were a crime, that forces good people to make impossible choices. This young man shouldn't have had to choose between the law and his sister's happiness. The fact that he did tells us something is broken, not in him, but in us, in the systems we've created." He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes fierce with emotion. "You go home to your sister. You give her that bicycle. You tell her it comes from a community that sees her, that values her, that wants her to know joy. And you remember this: the measure of a person isn't in their mistakes, but in why they made them and what they do afterward." The case was dismissed. Marcus walked out of that courtroom with $340 in his pocket, a medal around his neck, and a second chance at dignity. But the story didn't end there. Within hours, news of Judge Caprio's decision had spread through Providence. By evening, it had gone viral on social media. Some criticized the judge for being soft on crime, for setting a dangerous precedent. But far more people saw in Marcus Rivera's story a reflection of their own struggles, their own impossible choices, their own desperate acts of love in the face of an indifferent system. Donations began pouring in, not just for Marcus and Sophia, but for the community center where he volunteered, for programs supporting children with disabilities, for families struggling under the weight of medical debt. The bicycle shop owner, moved by the story, donated an adaptive bicycle specifically designed for children with cerebral palsy, worth over $2,000. A local physical therapy clinic offered free sessions for Sophia. A scholarship fund was established in Marcus's name for students who demonstrated exceptional community service despite personal hardship. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the thousands of people who heard the story and found themselves asking a simple question: what would I have done? Faced with a choice between the law and love, between rules and compassion, between what's legal and what's right, what would I have chosen? Because that's the truth that Judge Caprio's decision illuminated so brilliantly. We live in a world that often forces impossible choices upon the most vulnerable among us. We create systems that punish poverty, that criminalize desperation, that mistake suffering for moral failure. And then we sit in judgment of those who break under the weight of circumstances we ourselves have never had to bear. Marcus Rivera didn't need punishment. He needed help. He needed a society that recognized his worth, that valued his contributions, that understood that a young man who gives 500 hours of community service while caring for a disabled sister and maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working multiple jobs is not a criminal. He's a hero forced by circumstance into an impossible position. The secret under his jacket wasn't just a medal. It was a reminder that honor and desperation can coexist, that good people sometimes do wrong things for the right reasons, and that true justice requires not just the application of law, but the wisdom to see beyond it to the human truth beneath. Judge Frank Caprio understood this. In that moment when he stepped down from his bench, when he held that medal in his hands, when he looked into the eyes of a 17-year-old boy carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, he chose humanity over procedure, compassion over convention, love over law. And in doing so, he reminded us all of a fundamental truth. The highest form of justice is not punishment, but restoration. Not retribution, but redemption. Not the strict application of rules, but the courageous act of seeing the person behind the offense and asking not just, what did they do, but why did they do it and what do they need? So here's the question that Marcus Rivera's story leaves us with. In a world that often seems designed to break the spirits of good people facing impossible circumstances, what role will you play? Will you be the voice demanding punishment or the hand offering help? Will you see only the crime, or will you look deeper to find the human story beneath? Because somewhere in your community right now, there's another Marcus Rivera, another good person facing an impossible choice, another act of desperate love waiting to be judged. And the question isn't whether they deserve mercy, it's whether we have the courage and the humanity to offer it. What would you do?